Hi, welcome to the drawing board. My name is Luca, and today we're going to talk about shapes. This is what I tend to call shape design, how to best utilize them for our drawings and how to simplify them as much as possible, how to make our shapes look appealing and interesting and just cool. Let's get started with something you might remember from your geometry class: angles. There are two kinds of angles we want to concern ourselves with: obtuse angles and acute angles. Obtuse being greater than 90 degrees and acute being less than 90 degrees. When we're drawing and choosing the best shapes to include in our drawings, we want to try and opt for obtuse angles. They keep things open and don't feel as severe as acute angles. Let me draw a few shapes and show you what I'm talking about. See how the bigger one feels more open since it's mostly made up of obtuse angles? The one on the right feels more constrictive. Thinking of these shapes like rooms in a house can be very helpful. You want them to be nice and open and be able to see everything from any point inside. This bloated triangle shape is one I use a lot personally. It feels organic and full of life and is pretty simple and open, especially compared to some of the more complex shapes I would try to use in drawings. Something like this, for example. These sorts of overly weird shapes tend to lack focus and not feel very unified. You want your shapes to look like one thing, not just a weird blob of different ideas. Combining various simple shapes is almost always more effective than trying to make one big, complex shape. You want your shapes to be open, like these two, not constricted like these on the right. Now let's take a minute and talk about shape complexity. I'll show some examples of simple and complex shapes and how they differ. Now these three shapes are some that I use a lot. They don't have too many sides and are really nice and open. Note that I'm not afraid to bend the lines and that these aren't necessarily the types of geometric shapes you'd find in our math classes. Shape design is about taking the world around us and simplifying it into some very simple and interesting shapes. Here's a few more. I included some that use bigger curves, taking a big curve and throwing a straight line on the opposite side. See how simple these are? Now let me try to draw some complex shapes. See how these have many sides? They have a lot more going on and feel less unified. These sorts of shapes do have their place, but when you're trying to draw and simplify things into simple shapes, these sorts of complex looking forms don't really fit that purpose. These also have a lot of acute angles in them that conflict with each other and make these shapes feel very constrictive. They also don't really have a natural flow either, which is something that can really take the life out of your drawing. Okay, so now that you have some of these bigger ideas in your head, let's try and apply them. An exercise I really enjoy doing is pulling up photo reference and trying to take these really complex real life things and break them down into interesting flat shapes. When most beginners see a tree like this, they usually try to follow the outline of all these different complicated patterns of leaves. When you hyper focus on these outlines, you usually end up with an outline that doesn't feel very confident or purposeful. It sort of wavers and feels like it could fall apart at any minute. Some people can draw really well like this, but let's try to avoid this for now. What I recommend doing is looking at these trees and looking for the big shapes. I see this spade, almost shovel-like shape on this tree, and I lay down some lines to reflect that. See how even though I haven't shown any detail on these leaves, it still resembles that tree. Now I'll go on top of it and add some dark values, which will help to give it some detail. I pushed out from the initial big shape to add these curly lines. These help to hint at the individual leaves that I tried painstakingly to copy earlier. But instead of starting with those details, I began with a simple shape. And even though I have all these details now, because I started with those simple forms, I can still see the major shape of the tree. This is what good shape design is all about, using the simplest shapes possible so that when you add the details, it still feels uniform and whole. I want to take another shot at this tree using some different methods. I draw in this shape again with some loose, angular lines. I'm building a framework that I can build on later with some details. In this case, I end up with a rather large, coarse brush and use the grit of the brush to suggest the details of the foliage. The initial shape helped me plot out the design of this particular tree. And now that I have that solid structure, I can get creative with how I render the leaves. I'm just trying to have fun here. This is a fun little exercise, and you should really enjoy your time with this. It's a time to explore and enjoy the medium, whichever one that may be you're using. Now let's try to use a different reference this time. This time I'll use this picture of a large mountainous rock formation. Like I did with the tree, I try to use simple shapes to get the essence of this rock without trying to delineate every single detail, crack, and crevice. I stick to angular lines and avoid curves to make sure the rocky nature of my subject remains. I erased a few of my original simpler lines to be replaced with more of these detailed ones. These will add some character while keeping the original big shapes I started with. This feels like a great place to move on to trying to fill in the drawing with some shadows. When I'm filling in a drawing with shadows, I'm looking at the reference, but I'm also thinking about just drawing cool shapes, ones that are interesting to look at and will make the viewer stay with the drawing. I'm also making sure to have shapes that are darker and some shapes that are lighter gray. Something that a lot of beginners tend to struggle with is the idea of trying to make something look just like your photo reference. You can totally draw it like that, but I think it's more fun to use your reference as just a jumping off point, a point of inspiration. You can use it to make something entirely new. Let's keep going. For the other side of this giant rock, I decide to use a real big coarse brush like before and use it to add some fun textures. Look how I carved out the bottom of the shape to have a nice clean lines so that this whole rock looks like it has a whole unified structure. I want this to look like a solid form, solid and thoughtful and unified. Now I go back in to darken the left side so that it stands out from the lighter side on the right. You can take this process and apply it to any of the other mountains in the background. But for now, I just want to focus on this one here. Adding these shadows will give more definition and solidity. Learning how to break down the world around you into simple, interesting shapes is one of the most important steps when learning to draw. The next time you go for a walk, try to look for these simple shapes in the world around you. Try drawing using these techniques. Once you learn to see like this, then the world is your oyster. I wish you the best of luck and the best of drawing. Thanks.